all goes back to 1972 in November, where I had come out of university and spent a year in South America. And I came back to England, didn't know what to do with myself. So I volunteered to help with the resettlement of Asians from Uganda during that month. And I was posted to Honiton, Devon, to the Heathfield Resettlement Centre. And it all began from there. I was appointed by the Coordinating Committee for the Welfare Evacuees from Uganda to make good links with all the camp's residents, voluntary organisations, and to especially support the voluntary sector input into what was a government operation operated by what was then called Uganda Resettlement Board. My very first involvement in a very multiracial situation, apart from my travels, which I think did help me have a viewpoint about how it is to be an immigrant in a rather racist society. When Idi Amin made its decision to evacuate everybody, it obviously dominated the news coverage at the time. And there was actually a real debate within the Conservative Party about whether they could accept more, in quotes, immigrants. And so it wasn't straightforward, the politics at the time. I'd actually studied politics at Sheffield University, so I was quite a political animal. And I think initially I was determined to help because I was disgusted by the reaction of a lot of press and members of parliament who were resisting helping what were British citizens who were then residing in Uganda. Initially, we were obviously, it was about waiting for the flights to come in and coaches would arrive. People would arrive with very little luggage in a rather cold winter. And the first issues was just very basic things like providing warm clothing for people, at least trying to assist them with what was quite often traumatic surroundings when they're leaving Uganda. Many had pretty horrible experiences in Kampala airport before leaving, were treated quite roughly by the army there and other people. So people were inevitably traumatized. And this was exacerbated because many families became divided. At the time, in British immigration law, a woman was not entitled to bring her husband into the UK. It was actually overt sexual discrimination, which was eventually outlawed. But back in 1972, that resulted in a lot of families who maybe the wife or mother had British citizenship, but the husband was stateless. And the stateless people were not allowed to accompany their children or partners into the UK. They ended up in refugee centres, mainly in places like Sweden and Switzerland and other countries in Europe. And so on top of just the trauma of coming here, we were in a situation where a lot of families were separated by both racist and sexist immigration legislation at the time. The centre had civil servants working in it whose main job was to try and resettle the families. So a lot of work was obviously taking place between these resettlement officers and the families themselves. But obviously, while they were waiting for resettlement, which was not quick, the children had to go to local schools, and we had to get local social services involved. We had to get the voluntary sector involved, and groups like the WRVS, for example, played a very crucial role in really in supplying wonderful volunteers who made a big difference to the more formal approaches of civil servants who were rather bureaucratic. So I think we were a bit more responsible for the caring element. We had probably up to about half a dozen volunteers who were resident in the centre with me and some of the civil servants. And it was rather funny in a way because we had our own quarters. It was a bit like on a ship. We used to have our own restaurant. It was a bit like segregation in British style, colonial style. It was all a bit ironic. But when we got out into the wider community, of course, there was a wide range of volunteers from schools, from Exeter University, from sports organizations, you name it. There were people who were determined to be positive, and that was really welcome in what initially was some resistance to them coming to Honiton at all. People felt, well, if they're going to go anywhere, probably should not be Britain, but if not, they should be in Leicester, or they should be in Birmingham, or nearest to us, maybe Bristol. But certainly Devon, it was new territory. I would say that there was very little tension because most people who volunteered had a commitment to do something positive. And this was welcomed by the residents. And there was a feeling, well, we're all in this together. It was a bit like the war spirit in Britain, that people came together in a way that probably would not have done in peacetime. There was a little bit of that. And that was actually all very positive. As with all these sort of type of situations, there was some resistance to them coming. They thought they might be overwhelmed. They thought they might take our jobs, all the usual jargon you hear from people who are basically racist or anti-immigrant. But the local grocers began to find if they got Asian foods in the shop and everything, they get a bit more trade. And and of course, one thing about the British Asians from Uganda is they're quite entrepreneurial. And so relationships began to develop in a rather positive way where there was common interests. They made some money, but also people got the food and things that they would not find available in a place like Honiton. Inevitably, there would be tensions within the residents. I mean, some of that I think is stuff that came back from Uganda because some of the evacuees were, in fact, very well qualified, like doctors and technical people, and obviously more inclined to things like private education. But we also had much poorer families. So you couldn't generalize. So inevitably, as with all people, there were differences. We did set up a sort of committee of the residents, but inevitably at the beginning, it was dominated by the people who probably dominated in the colonial system from East Africa, where the Asians were very much an intermediary group brought over initially to build things like the railways in East Africa, who were in between the Africans and the colonial whites. And there's always elements of some of that sort of brainwashing going right through everybody who came, because their experience of British people was very much still colonial. You have to remember, these countries had not been independent for very long. And they were very, very used to their white masters deciding everything. But the Asians were in a slightly more privileged situation to the Africans. And one saw elements of racism in all parts of that, in miniature, in a center like ours. Having said that, I think the trauma of what happened and the situation of people who were in forced people to actually come together. And that was actually very positive. But inevitably there will be tensions. And, you know, there were religious differences. There are obviously geographical differences, all the differences of human beings worldwide. We're in a small contained center, which was a military camp, which is not the most wonderful sight. It's not like maybe a nice hotel. The accommodation was pretty dismal. And, you know, it's the conditions, I would say, left a lot to be desired. But it was one of the first times with a refugee situation, the British government had actually gone that far to support people coming in. So I've always given some credit to the Ugandan Resettlement Board at the time, but it was inevitably dominated by civil servants, most of whom were white, who had very little experience apart from maybe a colonial experience of working with Black people. I have actually very fond memories of getting very friendly with some immigration officers who were younger, who were seconded to work in the center. And of course, they spent most of their time being taught how to keep Black people out. But actually, they developed relationships within a center where we were all living together, which were very positive. And they often admitted to me when we were going to drink in the pub afterwards, it had really affected how they thought about the situation of their job up till then. And it was making them reevaluate how they approach people, how they deal with people, because they were being required by the government and people like us to resettle people as well as possible, to find employment, education, housing. And it was very different to having a negative approach about how do we keep them out. I mean, the numbers reduced as people were gradually resettled, but we still had hundreds of residents who were not resettled. But what the government did is they began to close centres, and we were one of the first to close. I always thought it was probably because of all the opposition of local Conservative MPs at the very beginning to even having the centre in the middle of Devon. All the people from the Heathfield Centre eventually went to Lincoln to an RAF base called Hemswell. And we convinced the government it would be good to do it in one block of people, as they already had relationships and all the rest of it. And they agreed with that. So one day we had a whole train hired, but all the hundreds of people left in the camp, and we trooped over to Hemswell. But of course, subsequently, a lot of those camps were closed increasingly as the numbers reduced. Yes, I did stay in touch with some people, and I ended up, after working with a number of organizations assisting so-called immigrants, I ended up working in Bristol with the Bristol Racial Equality Council. And of course, I knew some of the families who we had resettled from Devon. And that helped me a lot to make links to the Asian community in Bristol. I subsequently worked in Bristol then for 30 years in race relations. In terms of lessons, I think what was interesting about this particular experience, as I've sort of mentioned, is the government actually made quite a positive effort to resettle people. And I think that was a very useful experience. But unless you do have sufficient housing, accommodation, and resources, there will always be tensions. And we have to learn to work through those tensions. And it's not about keeping people out, it's actually about welcoming people. The one thing I did feel while the Ukrainian situation is going on is how remarkable it was and positive that so many people were willing to welcome people into their own homes. I have to say, we didn't really have that experience with Asians from Uganda. They were welcome to go to relatives and maybe their own community, but there weren't many people volunteering in the ways we saw recently with the Ukrainian situation. And prior to this, a very, very big wave of immigration happened from Somalia. Again, one did not notice British people really welcoming them. And it was usually local Somali communities, and all the rest of it, who provided most support and assistance. And so the Ukrainian situation was interesting, but I always wonder if they happened to have a black skin, would it have been like it has been? It's a good question to ask. And so much, I think, of immigration, unfortunately, is also driven by racist attitudes. And one of the major ones is people's color of skin. Britain is a very rich country. And although we might lack some resources in terms of housing, whatever, where there is a will, there is a way. And certainly there was a will by the government back in 1972, eventually with evacuees from Uganda. And there was with Ukraine, but you still feel the politicians always move rather slow, a bit resistant, because they are more and more interested in still portraying that the country is too full and we need to stop people coming in. Yeah. My experience with working with British Asians from Uganda was a very positive one, because I was thrown into a situation where within the center, the majority of the people were of South Asian origin. And of course, that's a very useful experience for white people to have. The wider society was completely different. But for me, that was very much a learning experience. And I'm always grateful for that experience. I think it's made me have a bit more humility. It's made me think a bit more positively about people worldwide. And I have always been very grateful. I'm always amazed how the human spirit sometimes can really win through in a very positive way. And for me, my human spirit was strengthened with that experience, no doubt. I think what was remarkable, actually now looking back on it 50 years ago, how incredibly successful so many of those families have since been and played a very crucial role in increasing the wealth of Britain. I mean, a very large number ended up in Leicester, but Leicester became a very wealthy city as a result of that migration. And many of those people have now gone on to do great things. Despite all the reservations everybody had, there was net benefit from that particular evacuation, because a lot of people with skills, with entrepreneurial skills, most of whom did speak English, have made a major contribution to cities and towns and villages throughout the UK. And some of them are very wealthy as a result.